Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Very warm note of appreciation to each and every one of you that has logged into our session today. On behalf of SAT and SORF, Orient Technologies, PwC, Titus, and McAfee, a very warm welcome to each and every one of you. Hope all of you all are safe and secure and enjoying your 2021 and looking forward to a very successful year ahead. So today's session is an extremely insightful one titled Building an Effective DLP Practice, a comprehensive overview on the deployment of DLP within an organization. So DLP, or data leakage prevention, has been an extremely conversed about topic within the industry over the past 3 to 4 years, both pre and post pandemic. It has been observed that data leakages have been occurring both intentionally as well as unintentionally in local and global contexts, costing organizations both in dollars and majorly in reputation. So the conversation on DLP has actually evolved to a stage where most regulatory bodies across multiple industries are pushing organizations towards implementing DLP as a mandate. So in analysis of this topic, it is starkly obvious that merely tooling your organization to satisfy a mandate or simply purchasing a product to satisfy the requirement of DLP is not sufficient when building a successful DLP practice within your organization. Ideally, DLP should be carried out in 3 phases, namely the initial phase, which is data identification and classification. Secondly, adaptive data loss prevention, and finally, secure collaboration. So in order to help us navigate and enlighten us all on this broad topic, we have with us 3 extremely distinguished panelists from PwC, Titus, and McAfee, who are going to walk us through this topic today. Representing PwC, we have Mr. Vengadha Selam Balagobi, who is the head of cybersecurity for Sri Lanka. Representing Titus, we have Mr. Maheshwaran, who is the regional director for India and SAARC. And representing McAfee, we have Mr. Vamsi Ponnakanti, who is the head of technical sales for India SAARC for McAfee. So without further delay, I would like to hand it over to our first panelist from Titus, Mr. Maheshwaran. Over to you.
Thanks, Anchit. I'm just trying to share my screen. Can you see my screen, and is my voice okay?
Yes, Mahesh, please continue.
Thanks, Anchit. Hello, everybody. Good morning. And I just wanted to thank you all for taking time out for this session today, which is around building an effective DLP practice. So I thought I'll start the presentation by just sharing the current landscape around data security. And I'm sure you all know this. You would agree that data has become the new perimeter. Digital transformation, cloud adoption, mobility, I think was anyways forcing organizations to make information available from anywhere and any device. But COVID and post-pandemic, now it's become a reality for most organizations. Organizations are now allowing access to critical information resources and assets from anywhere and any device. So essentially, data has become the perimeter. So it's critical for organizations to have a lot of controls around data, considering that more and more threats are now targeting data, because hackers also have realized it. Hackers have understood that data is moving beyond organizations' boundaries and assets. So there is no point actually, trying to compromise the perimeter or the asset which is storing data, but instead they're going after data because it's become an easy target for them as this data is moving freely out, free flowing, and it's moving beyond organizations' assets. Not just that, the regulatory landscape is also becoming more and more stringent. This is a report from WFA updated on 2020. So you could see that even 3 years back, the number of privacy regulations that existed in countries across the globe were almost 20% lesser. Both government as well as industry regulators are forcing organizations to protect employee and citizens' private and personal information. And we also understand that even in Sri Lanka, the Personal Data Protection Bill is in draft stage and it's being discussed, and we are hoping that it's going to be passed sometime this year. The same thing is happening in India too. So with the regulatory landscape becoming stringent, data becoming the new perimeter, and threats targeting data, we absolutely believe that organizations need to have more and more controls around data. And this session is going to be talking about three important controls, technology controls that revolve around data protection. And I'll be starting with data identification and classification. So when it comes to key drivers for data security, I think organizations will be able to protect information only if they know what information is sensitive for them and where is it residing. So one of the key drivers for organizations to gain visibility to sensitive information that exists across the enterprise and how it's being managed within the organization. With that knowledge, they also wanted to ensure that data loss risks or data leak risks are significantly reduced. So they are looking at optimizing controls that they already have invested or that they'll be investing to ensure that data protection strategy is comprehensive enough and data loss risks are significantly reduced. And I think organizations have started to realize that data security is just not a IT or a security initiative. Data security is a business strategy. So it's important to engage business users to understand what information is sensitive for them. Unless this happens, I think data security cannot be in an automated way. Most organizations who have deployed data protection controls, they are not able to realize value mostly because they have not engaged business users to understand what information is sensitive. So I think that's another key driver. They want to look at ways with which they can engage business users seamlessly and make them accountable to determine what information is sensitive for them. So once that happens, I think then data protection can be automated in a significant way, and will share. So thought of quote, sharing this quote from Forrester from one of their reports. Again, I think this is absolutely logical, right? It states that protecting data starts from knowing where it is and what it is. I think organizations, without knowing or without having this visibility, it's going to be almost impossible for them to have an effective data protection framework. So it's very, very critical for organizations to know what data is sensitive for them across the various business functions that exist within the organization and where is it residing. And data classification as a technology or control will help organizations to get this visibility. And that's what we recommend organizations when it comes to approaching data protection. So we honestly believe that by establishing identity to data that remains an unknown, unquantified state for IT and security organizations will be translated into meaningful information. And classification as a technology or strategy will help organizations to achieve this objective and engage users across various business functions within the organization to understand what data is sensitive for different business functions. And classification tools can be very simple. It could be simple labeling, or it can, and the technology has evolved, which applies intelligent data identification. And I'll share some examples of that later on, so that organizations can evaluate content, apply context when they derive classification and categorization of information. Once identity is established, for any specific information of interest, it could be regulatory information, it could be sensitive financial information, it could be intellectual property, organizations can then get a lot of visibility on how this information is managed within the organization and translate that into meaningful intelligence. So what I mean by that, let's take, for instance, if organizations want to know where all regulatory information is residing. By applying identification of to such information across the enterprise, organizations can then get a lot of intelligence that which all data stores are having this regulatory information with it, which all users are dealing with it, which all business processes are handling this sensitive information, sensitive regulatory information. Is this information shared internally or externally? And if yes, is it getting shared securely? So organizations can then get a lot of intelligence by establishing meaningful identity to data that can be used for accelerating data protection. Like say, for instance, I'll take an example. If it's a finance restricted information, organizations can put policies that once identity is established that to that financial information, any finance restricted information can definitely not be shared externally or to unauthorized destinations. And even internally, it is authorized to be shared only to finance department. So identity in a way will help organizations to accelerate and automate data protection. And I'll explain that with a few examples as we move on. So we have just captured some of the data types that are probably sensitive for most organizations belonging to different industry verticals. And I'm sure you would agree that each of these data types that are present a different risk for the organization. And it needs to be managed differently and treated differently from a risk reduction perspective. The reason why I thought of emphasizing this is when organizations are approaching to classify information, rather than classifying information into 4 or 5 large buckets like restricted, confidential, internal, public, and personal, which I think is important, will add definitely value. It's also important to categorize that information when organizations are looking at classifying information, because if organizations need to know why that information is restricted, IT and security teams need to know why is that information confidential. So that can be only that context can be only made available to IT and security teams if information is also categorized appropriately while organizations are trying to classify that information. So now you must be having questions that how do we identify information? And some of the questions that normally come to us when we engage in deployments or when we engage in prospect discussions is, we know that classification is going to touch end users. We know that classification is going to mandate users to classify information. But is it going to create a lot of overheads for them? I'm not sure whether we are ready to embrace this project. So these are some of the questions that typically occur in customers and prospects' mind when we try to have classification discussions with them. So the way we respond to these questions or concern is the classic analogy that we give is like a spell check experience that the user has when they create information or share information. Most of us are okay to do a spell check, when we create or share information, mostly because we don't want to create information with errors. At the same time, the experience that the spell check tool provides is very, very seamless. The number of mouse clicks that we have to go through when it comes to correcting errors in the document that we are creating is very, very minimal. So the spell check tool experience is the one that actually we think is making users to go and ensure that every document that they are creating is error-free. So classification experience to users also should be exactly the same. Every user will be mandated to classify information because the organization does not want them to create unintentional data loss incidents for the organization. Hence, they'll be mandated to classify information. However, the experience is going to be seamless because, like the way spell check tool automatically corrects a lot of errors, classification technologies have evolved to automate classification. And for some where it can't be automated, like the way a spell check tool shows suggestions, 3 or 4 options for the user to choose, classification technologies can also throw suggestions to the user how a specific information needs to be classified. And based on the suggestions, user can choose one of the options. And some definitely will be user driven. So as a sign-off criteria, normally at the end of the implementation, we will be having 40 to 50% of the information automatically classified. Another 20 to 30% will be classified through suggestion, and the rest will be manually classified. And this classification will be extended across the enterprise for data at rest. Even if it's legacy data that is residing in various data stores, we'll be able to discover and classify that information. And also for data that is getting created or data in transit. So we'll be able to extend classification seamlessly across information that exists in various forms. Through this slide. So you can see a sample loan, a mortgage loan agreement draft. Now you can see various sections within this document getting highlighted, like mortgage loan is a keyword that we are looking for. Then there are a lot of PI attributes like name, address, social security number, phone number, etc. So we are analyzing all this information because classification technologies have evolved and support machine learning, natural language processing, and some of the complex regular expressions to determine data like name, for instance. It's going to be very, very tough to determine name through simple regular expressions. So we have smart predefined policies available to look for name and other PI attributes across various geographies, including Sri Lanka. So once that's done, we check whether those PI attributes are available within the document or whether any sensitive information that we are looking for is available within this document. And if yes, will be established identity, and I'll explain that quickly. Also, you can see that entire document is also getting highlighted because classification tools can learn document templates or structures. For example, minutes of meeting templates, RFP templates, pricing or proposal templates, a legal document template. So we'll be able to learn these templates. So once organizations feed these templates to classification tools, based on the learning, wherever this document is residing, whenever classification tools have visibility to such information, it will go and categorize that information based on the learning. That once we perform analysis, what we then do is capture all the analysis persistently into document. We call that as document metadata. So every analysis that we do will be persistently captured and will stay within that document throughout its entire life cycle. And it's tamper proof. So you can see from the example here, what all context we are adding after performing this content analysis. Of course, we are categorizing this document as loan agreement because we have learned that through machine learning. In this case, the customer wanted to flag or put up whenever we see regulatory information. In this case, we saw GDPR information. So we are stating that this particular document has got GDPR information. Ignore loan ID for now. I'll come back to it later on. We are also capturing what is the PII type available in the document, what count of PII is available in the document. And if, data protection bills mandate consent, obtaining consent, especially if it's personal information. So whenever the user is saving a document, if it's got just one PII attribute there, could be a national ID or could be a bank account number, there could be a question thrown to the user asking him to validate whether it's his own personal data. And if the user says yes, there could be a follow-up question asking the person to provide consent to store this information on a corporate asset. And that response can be captured and populated into document metadata attributes. And this metadata field that we capture can be completely customized based on the business requirements and the organization's requirement. And it can be different for different business functions also. I said I'll come back to you on the loan ID part. So you can see here that there is something called an agency case number in this document. So this organization or this customer wanted anything under agency case number has to be extracted and populated under loan ID metadata value. Because the use case was if they wanted to know how many documents are they having, how many loan IDs, loan agreements are they having for a specific loan ID. Instead of doing a content-based search on the document, it'll be easy to get that result if they do a metadata-based search. And operationally, it's going to be much more efficient by performing such discovery. So this is the level of context classification tools can provide once it performs analysis, and the identity that we derive can be automated and can be persistently held within the document throughout its entire life cycle. So like the way I said earlier, I'll just move fast. Based on when organizations are approaching classifying information, rather than just classifying them through simple labels, it's also critical to categorize them and use this context to automate controls around data protection and realize better business value. So we firmly believe that classification acts as an orchestration layer or connects the dots with different data protection controls like a DLP or information rights management or a CASB. You can see some example use cases there. Say for instance, CASB. Once information is classified in cloud data stores like OneDrive, SharePoint Online, where we can go and perform discovery and ensure that information is classified. CASB can then read that classification metadata and ensure sensitive information is not shared with the external recipients. And if it is a restricted or internal information, it's not downloaded to unmanaged assets. So we can do that. DLP, again, Vamsi will explain that in detail later on, Vamsi from McAfee. DLP technologies can read metadata attributes that we embed into document and ensure restricted or internal information are not shared externally. Similarly, other controls also can leverage this metadata and can automate data protection capabilities that exist within that particular technology. So I'll just give an example of workflow. So in this case, you can see documents are classified as public, secret, internal, etc. And now when a public document is going through McAfee DLP, for instance, McAfee can understand that it's a public document and allow it. But if there is a restricted or a secret document sent out to unauthorized destinations or recipients, then McAfee DLP would be able to read that label and ensure it gets blocked. So that's a benefit of integrating classification with DLP framework. And classification tools, like the way I said earlier, will educate users when like throwing these banners, like coming up with banners like this. Whenever users are dealing with sensitive information in this Excel sheet, there are a lot of PI attributes. We can come up with active awareness campaigns or educational campaigns to let them know they're dealing with sensitive information. It also empowers users to go and determine information sensitivity, either through automated data identification or by suggestion or manual classification. Users will be empowered to determine information sensitivity. And that context can then be used to enforce controls around data protection, either natively through our classification offerings or by integrating with third-party data protection controls like DLP, IRM, etc. These are some of our clients. We have been privileged to work with these clients, and our classification product is 15-year-old and it's mature. And most of these customers are using our product for over 3 years at least. And the largest deployment that we have in APAC is with HCL. So all 130,000 users are classifying files and emails through our classification framework. Just a quick overview on our classification. I'll also, if you want to know more about this, we'll share details later on through SAT with you. Just in the interest of time, I'm just handing it over to McAfee. But one thing that I wanted to state before I hand over to him, though classification is going to establish identity by engaging users, it's also important to evaluate content with data protection. Like say, for instance, when a public document is shared externally, DLP technologies should evaluate content and ensure that that content is approved to go out. Through labeling, I think DLP can block information if it is not allowed to go, like say restricted or internal information. If it's not allowed to be shared externally, DLP can leverage that labeling and ensure it's blocked. But any content that is allowed to be shared externally, DLP also should evaluate content, ensure that appropriate content is being shared to a trusted recipient, and ensure that it's going to only an authorized recipient. That's what I think DLP would do. Vamsi will just share more details around it. So with that, I'll stop. And if there are any questions, please type that in the chat window and we'll address them at the end of the session. Vamsi, over to you.
Thank you, Mahesh. Sanchit, may I request you to please bring up my slides? Thank you, Sanchit. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking the time out. And I'll just continue from where Mahesh has left off. But before I do that, I wanted to introduce myself. Some of you may have already heard from me in the past. My name is Vamsi, and I lead the pre-sales engineering team for McAfee in India and South. Very honored to be speaking here. Now, we spoke about data, and Mahesh did give a little input into how data is very important for organizations and how it's actually changing the landscape from a organization protection perspective. I wanted to just give a perspective related to that. There is a very popular saying in cybersecurity circles currently, and it goes something like this. It says that it's not that any organization has not been breached. It's just that we don't know if we've been breached yet or not. And if it is true, the implications of that is very, very serious. The reason is, according to the cost of a data breach report on 2029 by the Ponemon Institute, the average cost of a lost record is about $150. And 58% of the total breaches were the result of hacking incidents that happen in an organization, right? And the average cost of a data breach for an organization is roughly about $3.92 million. Now, imagine if there was an organization that is in $10 million or $20 million in revenue, and if there was a data breach that happened and they lost nearly $4 million towards a data breach, or they had to pay towards regulatory fines, etc., it's not a very pleasant situation to be in. Now, add to that, can we move to the next slide, please, Sanchit? Add to that, when you realize that data is the new currency. We've been speaking about it. We speak that data is the new oil, and I'm sure all of us have heard this phrase before. But there has been an evolutionary shift in the form and manner in which companies create, access, and store data. And data is everywhere. It's pervasive. It's moving across. And when that thing happens and it runs an economy, it fuels an entire ecosystem. If you look at the cloud and everything that the cloud is bringing to us, everything is possible because the data is not only residing at one location, it's moving across and making matters worse for organizations. So it's all the more important for us to make sure that we keep the data at the center of our universe and plan for our strategies. Let's move, Sanchit. So where is the risk to our data? Next slide also, please. Sanchit. When you look at the risk that is there to data in an organization perspective, and you look at what are the different manners in which data is lost or leaked, there are quite a number of ways, right? So one of the Resides data breach investigation report from 2020 states that some of the common reasons why data is lost for organizations is social engineering. There's malware which is disguised as causing potential harm to organizations, but under the guise they steal data and then they ask for ransom to give the data back to the rightful owners. There's targeted hacking attacks that happen. Invariably, misconfigurations and some of the other aspects are also leading to cloud breaches. And of course, there's misuse of data that goes and ends up in other people's mailboxes or in their organizations because they just receive it by chance. And a confidentiality statement just does not cut it, right? If there is important data that is there, it can still lead to a lot of misuse. Insider threat, another major one. And you may not be planning for it, but some unintentional loss also results in data being taken away and used in a manner that is not how it is planned for. If you move to the next slide, Sansit, and it's even more of a challenge today, right? If you look at some of the key aspects that we've seen the world go through over the last 12 months, we realize that there's been a bunch of changes in which how the organizations have been working. There's a lot more remote workforce. There's a lot of new BYOD or rogue devices, as we call it, devices that have not been necessarily vetted or necessarily been given by IT organizations. And add to that, the third dimension is how cloud activity itself has been pervasive over the last 12 months, newer and newer cloud applications being used. All of this is just leading to a smaller footprint of data protection in organizations and a smaller compliance, because the first thing is for businesses to partner with IT and roll out applications, roll out means of accessing of applications rather than focusing on data protection and compliance from the word go. That's about establishing the need for data practice, adding on to what Mahesh has previously said. Sanchit, let's move to the next slide. So what is your data, right? If you look at an effective way of building out a data protection strategy, there is 5 large buckets the way we look at it at McAfee. One is to try and identify and then build out a means to classify that data. Mahesh touched upon a lot of aspects on how you can classify and how you can look at classification being one of the fundamental pillars from a data protection perspective. But what happens once you classify? What happens once you start using that data? The data is being used internal to organizations, being shared with partners, with customers, and with your own employees. And when that happens, how do you track that data? It's important to be able to identify data movements and identify and validate whether the movement of data is appropriate or if it is inappropriate. And once you move the different channels in which data moves, being able to apply protection strategies around that, identifying sensitive data and appropriate means of protection or remediation actions on top of that forms the next step. Then continuously monitoring, because just because we've given access to data to an individual at a point in time doesn't necessarily mean that they have perennial access to that data. If they move organizations, if they move departments, if they move job roles, there's a need for us to constantly relook at that and make sure that it is a part of our overall data protection strategy on a continuous basis. And none of this is actually very effective unless you're continuously educating. Last slide, again, I'll recall from what Mahesh has just shown to us. If you look at empowering users, empowering employees, educating them continuously, making them that much more in charge of their own data is a very good, healthy practice. And this gets built out over a period of time if you have an effective data strategy in place. And we'll hear from our partners at PwC on how you can operationalize some of this. Let's move to the next slide, please. That's it. So where is your data? Visibility and understanding of sensitive content is always the first step. Now, data on the endpoints, data in the network, data in the database, data in the cloud, which means that data is moving around, data is resting in some place, data is also constantly in use by application to application or cloud to cloud. Now, discovering that from our perspective is the most important aspect. And there are nearly about 300 different content types, right? So what are the content? Again, there's PII, there's sensitive data that belongs to an organization, there is intellectual property, all of that. And there's also options in terms of how you can look at that data and whether you can have some sort of automation built into that from a remediation perspective, which kind of feeds into classify and protect. So if you've got very clear understanding of your data, you can classify that data, and every time you read off that classification, you can take some automated remedial steps towards that. And this can happen across the cloud and on premises as well. Mahesh spoke a lot about classification, so I'll skip that part. Once you know what your data is, identifying that data and classifying that data. But then the most important part from our perspective is managing that particular data, right? So how do you view that data? How do you look at the movement of data? How do you see if that data is being used in the right manner or not? Are you able to go really deep in? Are you able to learn on the fly? Are you able to apply some analytics and artificial means of intelligence to be able to derive better means of measuring that data movement in and around? And constantly, so one of the key things also is from a compliance and a governance perspective for organizations. So continuously being able to look at reports, understanding the risk posture, and being able to customize basis our needs, basis the domain, or basis the vertical that we're working on, on what is the most important aspect of data for us and being able to read around that. Let's move to the next slide, Sanchit. So our philosophy at a McAfee perspective is about, you should have a means to protect your data irrespective of where the data resides. The data, as we spoke about, could be residing at an endpoint. It could be in data repositories, which are on your premises or in the cloud. The data could actually be moving over a network. You can be interacting with applications. You can be interacting with other data centers or websites and so on the fly. And then the pervasive cloud adoption we've seen over the last 12 months and beyond, the amount of data that we're seeing as a result of adoption of SaaS applications, adoption of PaaS and IaaS is just making this that much more complex, right? So when choosing a data protection partner, the most important thing is to identify somebody who can help you visualize your data, then provide a multi-environment data control. You can't have different data controls saying, my SaaS vendor is coming up and saying that I'm pretty sure that I will protect all of your data in there. You don't need to provide any other applications on top of what I already provide to be able to protect your data. I would encourage people to take it with a pinch of salt. The reason being that at an enterprise level, at an organization level, you should be able to make meaningful sense of everything that happens in a uniform manner, not in a siloed manner. You can't be looking at data protection on what I do at endpoints and what I do with my SaaS applications or what I do with my network or even my emails for that matter, because data flows in out through that channels as well. And so prevent data leak from multiple loss vectors, as we spoke about it, multiple vectors are in play. There's a constant need for not only matching exact data, because that's one way of identifying, but there's also data that is continuously being manipulated, used in different forms. So how do you break it down to a granular level, put in a bunch of fingerprint capabilities into that, and then look at means of identifying that data and protecting that. One of the other strategies also is a mandatory strategy, because we're now in a perimeter or a boundaryless world, is about making sure that we have an effective encryption strategy on our sensitive content. Several different opportunities exist for us to encrypt data at rest, at repositories, and you can even encrypt data on the fly through a bunch of different means, which we can elaborate at a later point in time as that. And define and enforce policies based on identity, device, and location. Again, very important, right? In the age of BYOD, in the age of any device, anywhere, any application, it's important for us to apply identification means at different points and apply data controls on top of that. Sanchit, let's move to the next slide and the slide after that. We already spoke, when I spoke about some of the threats initially, what the industry is facing. Insider threats contribute to nearly 50% of data breaches, right? Whether it is intentional or accidental. And according to the study of Ponemon Institute, I spoke about, the average global cost of insider threats rose by about 31% in 2 years to about $11.45 million. Now, that's not easy. So what do we do about that insider threat? How do you deal with data protection from an insider threat perspective? Let's move to the next slide, Sanchit. We'll see that there is a need for us to have increased visibility and control, address risky employee behaviors at the endpoints by protecting data sensitive from a day-to-day end user actions. Now, one of the means is classification. My apologies, it isn't supposed to be manual classification anymore. We live in a world where classification is so much more intelligent and autonomous that you can apply several different automated mechanisms around classification. So, I really like the example again that Mahesh brought out, making it as easy from an end user perspective as doing a spell check and correcting it on the fly. It's a part of coaching mechanism. It's part of continuously educating our users on, you're looking at data that is sensitive in nature, apply some sort of rules that helps us classify that and automatically protect that. And this continuous learning is very important, even when there is east-west traffic in an organization. And, as we identify more data, as we get in more control on some of that data, we'll be able to automate some of the actions as well. We don't need to wait for our data protection analysts to actually look at everything, have a manual reconciliation process to be able to say, allow this data to move or stop it from moving outside, because that comes at the cost of business. So always making sure that you let effective business be running at a pace that the business wants it, while protecting it continuously is the model that we are moving back to. And real-time feedback, the other thing that I just spoke about, right? Let's move to the next couple of slides, Sanchit. Let's move to slide. Yeah. So if you see the trends in cloud use now, I wanted to spend some time even from the cloud perspective, is because we traditionally looked at data protection as a different strategy for the on-premise environment, but as we start using the cloud, there has been a shared responsibility model that has evolved over the last few years. It's always been there. It's just become that much more imperative for organizations to look at a shared responsibility model. And the one thing that stands out is you are always responsible for protecting your data. When a breach happens, you've had enough indemnities from your cloud service providers or your SaaS providers that says that there is absolutely no indemnity that such a vendor actually accepts in the loss of data, and the responsibility of making sure your data protects for your customers is always on top of us. That's the summary on this. Now, if you look at, moving to the next slide, if you look at where is the sensitive data in the cloud, right? So 66% of it is in the top 5 SaaS apps, right? You want to be able to go out to the market and immediately service your customers through an enterprise ERP and something similar to that. Salesforce becomes an obvious choice. Yes, there are other players. Yes, there are very competing or very compelling alternatives available, but that's one of the things that is so pervasive. Again, we see that nearly 66% is in the top SaaS and 25 or 24% is in the IaaS and PaaS, because as you build out more and more custom applications on IaaS platforms, or take a platform and build your own application layer on top of it, data becomes that much more responsibility of the organization to protect. And there's about 24% of data that we see is sensitive in nature in that. And another major issue that we see is shadow IT. We've got so many organizations with IT departments within organizations that there's a lot of shadow IT that is there. That could be, in the form of development environments, in the form of storage, in the form of transfer services that you'd want to just get a big bulk of data to one of your colleagues in another geography. And if it is not regulated, you're in all probability posting very, very sensitive content in there. Being able to have visibility into that and putting out a protection mechanism around that is very important. Can we move to the next slide, Sanchit? So control what data is stored in the cloud. It's a very, very simple thing. Extend your enterprise data protection to win cloud services, both in SaaS and IaaS and PaaS. Enforce DLP policies based on keywords and data identifiers, indexed data matching, exact data matches. So no matter what happens, the data doesn't change, right? It just changes form in the manner in which it moves, but the data itself remains more or less the same. If there's BI data, whether you store it on your organization's server or if it is in the cloud, the data remains the same. So continuing to have a cohesive strategy, very, very important. And a multi-tier remediation based on severity, whether you want to quarantine that to understand what is the need for data to be moving out of the organization, to having an immediate remediation in the form of deletion of that data from going out and raising an incident from a triaging perspective, also very important. And as we also see that certain times when data breaches happen, it's often because of a result of one of the things that I called out as malware or ransomware or extortion models where you are logged out of your own data. So having an effective resilience model to be able to roll back in an automated fashion to a best known previous point to not allow business to be hit, your business operations to be hit. Again, very important from that perspective as well. Let's move to the next slide. And this is probably my last slide. And the BYOD problem statement again that I said is it's no longer a problem statement with just the data. Data, you can have all sorts of data controls in place, but if you allow a device that is not authorized to connect to that just by some identity that is authenticated. So if Vamsi is allowed to access a particular cloud shared drive and he has access to move data around, if I don't put in any controls at the device level, the data protection is as good as what that device is allowed to do. Because it's still looking at Vamsi, hey, this person is authorized to access this data, give them unbridled access. So it's important to also have some sort of a device strategy around that and being able to block and sync download to unmanaged devices, maybe drive additional compliance to such devices and so on. So that's the way we look at it. We see a very thin line between threats acting on devices accessing data, and data moving unbridled inside, outside the organization. So having a cohesive strategy is what McAfee helps. And that's the final slide I have after this in terms of calling out saying, in summary, we have a very cohesive platform that helps protect, deal with threats and all of that across the enterprise, and McAfee can help. One of the things that I called out before I wrap up is, once you determine that data has to move out of organizations to maybe say vendors, to partners, there's also very important need to monitor that data, not just from the access or protection and all of that. What happens if there's a genuine need for you to transfer? How do you control things that you don't have in control? There is an entirely different concept, which I'd pass it back to Mahesh to speak about it very briefly. And obviously, if you have any questions, we can address them towards the end of the session. So Mahesh, over to you again. Thanks for hearing me out.
Thanks a lot, Vamsi, for the insightful session. I'm just conscious of time. So what I'll do is, and I know that we have a very insightful topic from PwC. So I'll just maybe take 2 or 3 minutes to go through this. Sanchit, can you just confirm whether you can see my screen?
Yes, Mahesh, please proceed.
Okay, I'll just quickly talk through this. Like the way we mentioned earlier, there are 3 critical information protection controls when organizations are looking at protecting information. We've already talked through data classification. It establishes identity. Vamsi talked about in addressing data loss over various channels, monitoring user behaviors and things like that. And data loss prevention as a technology will ensure that identified information is not shared to inappropriate recipients or destinations. But there could be a lot of scenarios like Vamsi mentioned, where organizations have to share information to external parties. Organizations might be collaborating with a lot of external resources, and they have to share that information. But what happens once the information is shared? In that case, DLP has to allow this information to go to that recipient. But organizations, once they share the information externally, will not have visibility in terms of what the user is doing with that particular information, and is that information being misused or not. So IRM as a technology, information rights management as a technology, will help organizations to track what the user is doing with information, even after it gets shared beyond the organization's perimeter and boundaries. And at any point in time, if the organization wants to revoke access to information that was already shared, organizations will be able to do that. So IRM, in a way, I would say, protects data and follows the data. The rights gets enforced on data irrespective of where it is. And organizations can decide how long this data needs to be valid, even after it gets shared. So the way it complements the existing ecosystem is like, say, CASB or data loss prevention technologies is going to protect data and ensure that it's not reaching inappropriate destinations or recipients. But once it's shared, whereas the IRM technology that we use, that we have with health systems, it's going to ensure that data gets protected even after it gets shared. And the way we do that is like any sensitive information, once it's identified, we ensure that it gets encrypted at file level. We do AES 256-bit encryption. And then we enforce appropriate access control to that file. Like what I mean by that is only authorized users will be able to even get access to this particular file. So we authenticate and authorize users. And if they have privileges to view the file or access the file, then only they get the permissions to get the keys to decrypt and view the information. And then it also enforces active file security. So what we mean by that is, like say, for instance, if you're sharing a file and if you don't want the user to forward that file to anyone else or print that particular file, modify that particular file. So rights get enforced on that particular file and the user will not be able to violate the rights or misuse the file because of rights getting enforced and staying within that file throughout its life cycle. Not just that, ours is completely a SaaS-based offering. So any rights that gets enforced, whatever the user is doing with that particular file, when he's opening, when he's trying to view the file, is he trying to misuse the file, everything gets audited. And at any point in time, the organization wants to change the right or revoke access, organizations would also be able to do that seamlessly without creating any end user overheads. So with that, this is just a quick overview of our IRM offering. Again, if you have more questions, please type in the chat window, we'll address them now. Or if this is of more interest to you, we can share some additional details to you later on through SAT. So with that, I hand over to, and these are some of our clients for IRM. I hand over to Gobi from PwC. Like the way I'm sure you would agree, data protection is a strategy. It revolves around people, process, and technology. Yes, technology plays a role in ensuring that it addresses risk significantly. But if the people process controls are not addressed or enforced comprehensively, it's again going to create a big gap in enforcing data protection strategy. So I would hand over to Gobi from PwC to talk through the people process aspects and how data protection has to be looked holistically. Over to you, Gobi.
Thanks, Mahesh. Okay. Sanjit, can you guys see
Yes,
my
Kobe, your
screen?
screen is visible and you are audible. Please proceed.
All right, thank you. Right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining this. And I think this has been a very good session to educate the organization in terms of data protection and how technology can be used. So what PwC is bringing here is in terms of how the process need to be carried out and in terms of staff awareness as well. So Vamsi and Mai spoke about in terms of the technology is part of it. So we would be carrying out in terms of looking at how we can deploy them and uh, carry out the engagement like jointly, which would give more identification in terms of data classification, like what Mahesh brought out, saying data protection. One part becomes the data classification, which is the identification. So we would come in terms of identifying the organization, the data. So let me start. So just a class, just a definition, like it's obviously it says a process of organizations data by relevant categories, right? So these where you identify the data as what is available in the organization and identify the categories and how you can protect them and use them. So that's in nutshell. So why do you want to have data classification? Now, if you see most of the regulations requirements are there, like example, if you start doing data classification and you have to go through the full process where you will identify what data is available, stored, or used by the company, and you will have a total list of data that has been used. So that's the as Vamsi said, it's kind of data has become the kind of oil now. It's equal to oil, or I can say it's more than oil kind of a thing, right? So then what you do is you have to do the data classification to determine what kind of um, risk mitigating controls that you can apply, and it can be like what kind of access the user accesses, what kind of data that is going out. Example, it can be PII information, SII information, and those things, how you are going to protect them. And apart from that, you also have mostly there are regulatory mandates like PCI DSS, EU GDPR, and then there would be Sri Lanka Personal Data Protection Act, which is already there. I think it also would come in to effect most probably recently. So all these regulatory mandates would require in terms of identifying PII information, SII information, how you're going to protect them. So all these information you would collect if you start doing a data classification. So let me start taking through the process that we carried out, like how we carry out these engagement to identify data classification. So if you take data classification method, like although it's technology driven approach, and then it covers the full data life cycle. And if you say on this side, like if you can see the icons that is there: collection, storage, usage, disclosure, and retention. So this is the total life cycle of data. So if you take in terms of that, then we would carry out a governance aspect of it, like where we would look at in terms of data security, privacy strategies, and establishing data governance programs, and also identify what kind of data the consumer is looking at, or what kind of data that is need to be secured, and what could be under threat at that point. And the policies and procedures would be aligned looking at those threats. And if you see a discovery also would be carried out to identify what data is available in the company, and to classify them, and to identify and tag them as well. We will help them what kind of how it can be tagged. Example, if it's a you would have tagging highly confidential, and public, and even uh, uh, public like. So those are the categories, like main categories. There could be a few other categories as well. And then the other part, whatever the data that you have identified, you will have to see how you are going to secure them. There could be situation in terms of, as Vamsi pointed out, saying that data could be in transit, or it could be in rest. So all these um, aspect, or at these areas, you need to look at in terms of how you're going to secure those data. So we would come up with the strategy to point out identifying each data, and to give the organization what kind of controls or the mitigating controls that you can apply to those data. And also Vamsi was talking about the last point, or the previous point before the last one, he was talking about in terms of disposing of data. And obviously we need to look at in terms of establishing a policy and a procedure to discover data, to see what kind of sensitive data that is going to be disposed, and the process need to be carried out. In terms of example, if you have example, let's say it's a bank, and you have a customer master file data which is there, it's going to be disposed. And what are the process that you need to look at? Like, example, if you want to dispose it, then the process generally need to be, there should be at IT division, they need to look at what data is going to be disposed and how the data is going to be. Maybe it can be formatted, and then it could be sent for destroy. So while that is happening, there should be a person, a company, organizations, a person should be accompanying the third party to verify whether actually it is been done. So these are part and parcel of processes and policies that you need to bring in, and PwC would help you to implement them. So next stage, if you take the data lifecycle model, this is what I was explaining previously. So if you take, these are the stages of work that you do. Example, if you take governance, data governance, and protecting strategies, these are in terms of policy and procedure level. And we look at data use. What kind of data is being used by the organization? Example, if you take a bank, financial institution, where they are required to submit AML reports, CRIB reports, and likewise. So even NPL information to central bank. So those are information which are being transferred. So we need to identify how these are being done. And if you take legal holes, example, maybe a financial company, there could be central bank guidelines. And if it's a hospital, it can be HIPAA, and even finance, it can be PCIDS as well. So when you say discovery, we would carry out a data discovery, and then data flow diagram, in terms of we would identify each and every process that are available in the organization, and we would carry out the data flow diagram to identify what is the data flow is about, what kind of data flows through the line. And then we will start classifying along with the organization, the stakeholders, to see how that need to be classified based on their strategies as well. Then identity aware, like we would help, we will start educating, or we will carry out a education program to the staff members to understand what is data classification is all about, and also to make them aware how they need to classify data as well. And thereafter the tagging part, mostly like the tools that was previously was presented by Vamsi and Mahesh. It had AI component as well. So what we do is we will initially try to tag them according to the categories that is available. Then the tool will take over from there. So on the other hand, secure side, data protection and data access. Data access, you all may know, like you have to give access in terms of need to know basis, or it can be even for third party or internal staff. how we are going to secure them. So now, if you take the staff are the most vulnerable to data leakage at this point of time. Like most of the leakages happen through staff, where all the other controls are in line, whereas the link weak link is the staff. So you need to keep them always uh, on the toes, like make them aware in terms of security controls that need to be adhered to. So then you get monitoring. So all data need to be monitored in terms of example. You will have to enable all the logs to see, and that log need to be monitored to understand what's been happening uh, in the systems. So, and if you take the third party risk management, I think most of the companies would do their maybe salaries to a third party. So you need to identify what kind of data that are available at the third party and how they manage their data as well. That is not their data; it's the organization data is being given to a third party. So then you have incident response. How you going to do react to incidences? And then, as I explained before, backup, archiving, and retention, all these policies need to be looked at, where PwC would help you all to do that. So, okay, these step-by-step work lot that we would do, and I would just go through in terms of what kind of deliverables that we would give in terms of each and every stages that we were talking about before. Right. So if you take in terms of governance, initially there will be a kickoff meeting and stakeholder would be and then minutes of meetings would be shared, and then we would be requiring the organization to appoint a steering committee to run this engagement, and then we would establish a detailed project plan, and which will be given to the client. Next stage, we would do the discovery, and we would use Qualtrics data collection survey model, and we do collect all the data in terms of all the processes that are available in the organization, and then we start analyzing them, and then we would inventorize them to the organization. And then this is a sample of the Qualtrics data collection tool that we use, and that is customizable for organization. It is not a standard one. It'll vary from organization to organization. And then if you look at securing, so whatever the data that we collected through the data inventory, we would carry out a risk assessment in terms of each data element, and we would give you a risk assessment with the how we are going to mitigate those risks, along with and thereafter we would be having a discussion with the stakeholders of the organization to see whether they are agreeable in terms of the mitigation controls that we have given. So this is a point where we would be jointly working with the organization. There could be situations where controls that may not be able to implement, or there could be a workaround for those. So that's one part. And then requirement assessment of data governance. So this would also, like, it will become interested party risk and opportunities. Like, there could be third party risk assessment also would come in. And then it's implement and dispose. Disposal I explained on the previous slide itself. So if you take on the implementation, we would carry out all the policy procedures, and then we will hand over to the organization, and it will be taken up by we would give the policies and procedures that are developed, and that would be agreed with the stakeholders, and it will be presented to the steering committee. And then preparation of risk template plans, and we would carry out the risk template, and this is a living document that will be given to the customer, and each and every time they have to make sure that there have been updations for those, because if there's a new system or new process comes into this organization that need to be taken in, and even they have to go through the same cycle, like identifying the data and then controls and the risk assessment as well. And that's all from me. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Gobi. Thank you, Mahesh, and thank you, Mr. Vamsi. That was an extremely insightful session. So, ladies and gentlemen, once again, I would like to remind you all, if you all have any questions, you all can submit in the Q&A tab. To the panelists, we have a few quick questions. I'll just put it to you all, and whoever feels that you all could answer it best, kindly just provide your answers. So first, we have, I think Mr. Vamsi, you'd be able to answer this. So when you were speaking on DLP, within the solution, within most solutions, if you could just inform the meeting, through DLP, there are quite a lot of features that actually bring into your network through a solution. Could you elaborate on like certain features, like are you able to restrict certain website accesses? Are you able to prevent malware like that? Are there any unique features that you could elaborate on through a DLP solution that can be provided?
Sure. So let me answer this. It's going to be a brief answer. DLP is a very comprehensive solution, but it also is an evolutionary solution. So it's not like you set a bunch of policies and then you get all the data protection on day one. You need to keep evolving that over a period of time. My typical experience is that DLP evolves in organizations anywhere between 12 to 18 months, and it gets to be really good over a 36-month period. Having said that, the other part of the question is, does it have any unique features around malware, etc.? Malware is not a function of DLP. However, there are adjacent capabilities which helps you look at a holistic endpoint protection that looks at if there's malware and whether the life cycle of that malware itself is leading towards loss of data. So that kind of intelligence does exist, and it's not a function of DLP per se. But if you look at the overall capability of the DLP solution itself, it is extended to the enterprise. You can protect your endpoints, you can protect your email channel, you can protect the network channel, and also cloud SaaS applications, IaaS and PaaS. So that, from that perspective, it's a very comprehensive DLP capability, and you can build that out over a period of time.
All right. Thank you, sir. Next, Mr. Gobi, I think you'd be best suited to answer this. You touched a little bit on the regulations that are there in Sri Lanka, especially the PII. Could you kind of elaborate on how stringent these regulations are right now and what you feel would be the direction moving forward?
Okay, so now if we take the PDP of Sri Lanka, now there is a value, or in case of a breach in terms of breaching the requirements of PDP, there is about 20 million rupees penalty. Like even GDPR is also having the same kind of a penalty in case of violation of private client information. So this is vital. Like most of the companies who deal with EU clients, they have already moved into EU GDPR implementation. So even then, as far as I think now it's on draft stage, the Sri Lankan one. So if they start implement, if it's been enacted, and then it'll be serious for each and everyone. So I'll add something more to this. Like if you see most of these people, even I myself have getting SMS, right? Obviously you don't know where you have given this data, right? So this is part of your PII information. So these also would be controlled in future if PDP is being enacted. So that's all. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Gobi. Mr. Mahesh, if you could just weigh in on this question. Now, when you speak on products like Titus, just to know, if you could just like enlighten the audience, is there an auto classification feature? Like, let's say, for example, if there is data that is stored in a repository within your network or even on the cloud, or let's say at the time of creation, is it possible without the user or the author actually making the classification of the data at that point? Are there solutions that have the capability to auto classify data?
Yeah, thanks, Sanchit. Yes, the answer to that is yes. The short answer is yes. Like the way I showed during my presentation, Titus classification, for instance, can examine the content that exists within the document. And that document could be residing on a user's endpoint, or the user is about to save the document from a web application onto their endpoint, or this document could be residing on cloud data stores like O365, G Drive, etc. Wherever it is, Titus data classification would be able to evaluate content, apply necessary context for determining classification and categorization. That way, we strongly believe we'll be able to reduce a lot of overheads in engaging users to identify or establish classification to information.
All right, thank you, sir. Then this is a question to the panel. Could you please elaborate on the main difference between HDLP and NDLP?
Let me take that, Sanjay. Yeah, so it's a pretty simple thing. HDLP is host DLP, so everything that happens on the endpoint, anything that you can control from the endpoint perspective. NDLP stands for network DLP, so anything that traverses data, traverses through a network, happens from a server to server, etc., needs to be looked at from that perspective. So that essentially forms network. Now, there's a lot more details as you build that out, but essentially the difference is those two: something that you can do at host and something that you can do at the layer, at the network layer.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, sir. Then once again, a question to the entire panel. So if you are an organization, and when you have an organization that has a limited awareness of their risk, for example, around their data, but are not demanding a DLP solution, what would be the best strategy for IT to engage them to kickstart a DLP project?
Yeah, I think maybe I'll take it, and then Vamsi, Gobi, you can just add your thoughts there. So I think when firstly, it's strange to know that business is not treating data security seriously, because based on our discussions with most customers, data security has become a boardroom discussion, I would say, generally cybersecurity and more importantly, data security. I think senior management and senior stakeholders definitely understand the risk it presents to business if information gets lost. And there are numerous examples that are coming almost in every month, I would say, around data breaches and what impact it's creating for organizations. So I think the thing that we would normally recommend is when it comes to creating this awareness with business, I think if the risk is presented from a business perspective in terms of how data loss is going to present risk to business, I think normally we have seen IT and security organizations getting approvals from business to initiate DLP projects. So there are, and I'm sure PwC and Vamsi can add on. So we normally engage in something called data loss risk assessments where organizations can monitor their exit. Their channels, predominant channels with which information can get leaked over a period of time, and then present the risk to the business that they can understand, which more from a business perspective. And I think we have seen when this gets presented appropriately, business voluntarily getting engaged and trying to understand from IT on how this risk can be mitigated. So I think a short answer is translating the risk that business can understand will definitely accelerate the process of deploying data protection holistically for an organization is what I think. Vamsi, Gobi, you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I'll just add a quick thing. Mahesh, I think you summarized the risk is always to the business. The control is always with the IT. So I think IT is not in a position to determine the risk. Understanding data, getting visibility, and understanding the flow of data itself often helps us arrive at what is the business risk. And that, when presented with means to control that, forms the IT decision. So that's the way I would look at it. And that's the way I would encourage organizations to look at it when presenting internally to business or to IT.
I'll also add a few things we can look at if an organization to identify what data is available, they need to do data discovery and identify. So they will understand, what kind of data is available and how they can do a control. And along with that, they could also do a risk assessment and see what kind of controls that can be applied. And based on that, they can look at what kind of DLP solution or any solution that they're going to purchase. And then this need to be educated to the board level, and what kind of business impact there would be in terms of those data being compromised. So that's the main thing that need to be done. The IT need to go up and tell them that this is what need to be done with figures.
Okay, thank you. So I think the general consensus is to basically opt at looking at DLP as a business strategy as opposed to an IT initiative. Then one last question to the panel before we wrap up, because I think we are almost at the end of our time. So if you have a current DLP tool or a DLP practice installed, how best would you all recommend to evaluate its effectiveness?
Should I take that, Vamsi, or you want to take it?
No, I was just about to take it. You can add, of course, Mahesh. You have a lot of experience here. See, I think both Gopi, myself, and Mahesh touched upon it briefly. DLP is as much about the process and the people as much as it is about the technology. And at all times, understanding what is the most important data that we have and how does that impact my organization determines how successful we are with the DLP technology at any point in time. The tool is just 1/3 of the overall thing. The tool will just protect your data, but what data to protect? Who all does that data touch? Where all does it move? Forms a bigger aspect of protection. So it has to be a continuous strategy. It has to be something that needs to be assessed every now and then. And a big testimony to that would be how many incidents did you have where sensitive data was actually going out and how many manual interventions had to be made. And you need to continuously tweak. So that forms a big part of effectiveness of data protection from my perspective. Mahesh, you can add a little more on that.
Yeah, thanks, Vamsi. So yeah, I would just take the question back on what were the business objectives for you to actually deploy a DLP, and the DLP deployment is meeting those business objectives or not. Most times we see organizations deploy DLP predominantly from a compliance standpoint, and then maybe till implementation they realize value. But once that's done, because data security is a continuous journey, organizations really struggle to demonstrate value. So I think it's always important to look at what were the business objectives to deploy data protection or DLP as a strategy, and is this technology helping to achieve those objectives or goals is something that needs to be constantly monitored. Some of the easiest metrics that I think will help organizations to measure effectiveness is coverage of data, like is the organization understanding information that could be sensitive across various business functions? What is the coverage? Risk reduction metrics in terms, I think Vamsi pointed out, number of incidents. Like I would say, how many policies are being configured to block sensitive information going out? Is DLP deployed in block mode or not? If yes, for what percentage of policies? How many incidents are getting reduced? Normally, one of the recommendations that we provide is every 2 weeks, there should be at least 20% risk reduction, 20% reduction in incidents for each policy. So that's when we can see that policy fine-tuning is becoming effective. So I think that's another metric. And lastly, user awareness. What percentage of information is getting leaked or lost because of unintentional user mistakes? I mean, if users are not being aware of what information, whether the information is sensitive for them or not. How are we creating awareness to reduce these unintentional data losses for the organization? So these are some of the metrics that organizations can keep track of and actually present to board or senior stakeholders to demonstrate how DLP is reducing risk for the organization. Kobe, you want to add anything?
No, both of you added as much as possible, so I don't have anything more.
Okay, thank you so much, gentlemen. So with that, I think we can wrap up the session. So before we end, thank you so much to each and every one of you that logged in today. I believe it was an extremely educative session, and I believe we can all take a lot back to the places that we work and hopefully build on driving DLP as a business practice, not as just an IT initiative, as was stressed through this session that we had today. So on behalf of SAT, SRF, Orin, PwC, McAfee, and as well as Titus, I would like to wish you all a safe 2021 moving forward, and thank you to each and everyone for logging in. We will be sending you all the webinar along with a small Q&A and a feedback form for you all to go through. So once again, thank you each and every one of you, and thank you to our distinguished panelists, Mr. Mahesh, Mr. Gobi, Mr. Vamsi. Thank you so much for logging in, taking times off your busy schedules, and we hope all of you all will walk away from this session more enlightened than and hopefully the concept of DLP is demystified rather than it still being a myth. So thank you so